Wow, what a great turnout. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Politics and Prose. I'm Brad Graham, the co-owner of the bookstore, along with my wife, Lissa Muscatine, and we're delighted to be hosting Charlie Trueheart, who's here to discuss his new book, Diplomats at War, Friendship and Betrayal on the Brink of the Vietnam Conflict. Charlie, as many of you know, was a journalist for a number of years, first with papers in Greensboro and Baltimore, then Publishers Weekly and USA Today. After a detour of a few years into academia as associate director of Harvard's Institute of Politics, he returned to journalism and in the mid-1980s joined the staff of the Washington Post. There he initially covered books, authors, the publishing industry, and literary and intellectual issues. Then in 1992, he became a foreign correspondent based first in Canada and then in France. He left the Post in 2000 and found his way a few years later to the American Library in Paris, where he served as director for a decade, from 2007 to 2017. His new book blends a very personal story involving his father with the larger history of America's early steps toward its disastrous war in Vietnam. Charlie's dad, Bill Trueheart, was the second-ranking diplomat at the U.S. Embassy in Saigon in the early 1960s, and the ambassador then, Fritz was a close friend of Charlie's dad and godson to both Charlie and his brother. It was during their tour when in 1963 U.S.-backed military coup overthrew the Diem government, and Diem himself was assassinated. And Charlie's dad and Nolting, the ambassador, had differed sharply in their assessments of the Diem government, which you're going to hear a lot more about in a minute, and what to do. And their differences led to a very bitter split that ended their friendship. And the two men never spoke to each other for the rest of their lives, and Charlie's dad even opposed Charlie's desire to attend Nolting's funeral years later. And now that both men have passed, Charlie, who was 12, it's 12 years old when Diem was assassinated, has gone back and drawing on government documents, oral histories, interviews. He's chronicled the events that led to Diem's fall and woven in the family story of his dad and Nolting. It's really quite a son's tribute to his father to have pieced together this history, and the book has been praised by Publishers Weekly as an important and unique contribution to the early history of the American war in Vietnam. Now, in conversation with Charlie will be Evan Thomas, who I know is familiar to many of you here. He's very familiar to us. It seems to be moderating events for us here at the rate of like once a month or something, and when he's not here talking about his own books. Evan, of course, is a former journalist and an accomplished author. He spent nearly a decade with Time magazine, then reported and edited at Newsweek for more than 20 years. He's taught writing and journalism at Harvard and Princeton and has written 11 books, most recently Road to Surrender, which came out last year and is about the decision-making in 1945 in both the U.S. and Japan surrounding the dropping of nuclear bombs on Japan. So ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming both Charlie and Evan.
Thank you, Brad. Is
Thank you, Brad.
Politics and Prose the greatest bookstore of them all? Yes.
Yes.
Charlie has a wonderful phrase in here. This is a work of memory hiding inside a work of history. And it's all that and more. But Charlie, why don't you just set the stage for us?
Well, for those of you who haven't read the book, the story takes place in the early 1960s in Saigon, mainly, in Washington, too. This was a period when John F. Kennedy had just become president of the United States, And after suffering the ignominious defeats at the Bay of Pigs and with Khrushchev in Vienna, turned his attention to this growing, nagging problem of a communist insurgency in South Vietnam, and a government that the United States had had a large hand in installing in the mid-1950s was having trouble not just fighting the Viet Cong, but retaining the allegiance of its own people. And it was a family-run country, even though democratically elected. And during the summer of 1963, especially, there came what became known as the Buddhist crisis, when probably the one moment, the one image that all of us who were alive at the time can remember is of the monks, plural monks, self-immolating that summer in protest of the regime of Ngo Dinh Diem, the president. And at that point, it became clear to Kennedy and to people in the embassy that Diem didn't have much of a future, and there was set in motion for the next several months this kind of agonizing endgame of the U.S. wanting to pull the plug on this government and wanting to focus again on this communist insurgency. And the events that I describe in this book are about divisions in Saigon at the embassy, as Brad said, between the ambassador and the military on one side, and the DCM, my father, the chargé d'affaires for much of this period, and the press corps, the American press corps on the other, just to simplify it. So that's the stage I'm setting.
So who's Fritz Nolting? Tell us about Fritz.
Fritz Nolting was a career diplomat, not yet 50 when he was named ambassador to Vietnam in 1961. He had served at the U.S. delegation to NATO in Paris, where NATO was at the time. And his deputy there was my father. These two men had known each other at Charlottesville. They were graduate students intending to be professors of philosophy. And in 1941, when the U.S. entered the war, they served, my father in the Army and Fritz in the Navy, and went to work in the State Department after the war, joined the Foreign Service in the 1950s. And when Fritz Nolting was named ambassador in Saigon, he asked that my father come to be his deputy. So the old friends from Charlottesville and from Paris, where we had lived in the 50s, were reunited in Vietnam for what one person said this was supposed to be a dream team, these two men, and it turned out to be nightmarish as a personal matter between them.
So when Fritz Nolting died, you went to your father because you wanted to go to the funeral, and what did he say to you?
Well, I should say, prefacing that, that my father, this terrible thing that happened in Saigon, not just the fact that it was the beginning of the Vietnam War, but this break between him and his former best friend was something we never discussed in my house. There was just an end to this relationship. And so I never heard my father speak of this at all, but I knew enough from my mother and from things that I read, notably David Halberstam's book, The Best and the Brightest, which tells this story. I knew that that's about all I knew about this. And in 1989, when Fritz Nolting died, I gathered up my courage, went over to their house on Hawthorne Place here in Washington.
I should say you were his godson.
I was Fritz Nolting's godson, yes. And my brother was his other godson. I went over to the house and said, I think I'm going to go down to Charlottesville next week for the memorial service for Fritz. And my father said, not if you care what I think, you won't. And I was stunned by the fact that he still bore this grudge, and that I knew so little about it. So you could actually mark the beginning of the work I did on this book from that moment. I didn't go to the memorial service. I followed his wishes, and as I say in the prologue to this book, I think writing this book was possibly another act of defiance, but I see it in part as an act of reconciliation, and there has been some reconciliation between me and my godmother, who's still alive at age 102 in Charlottesville, and at least one of her daughters.
So let's go back to what set this off. Describe a little bit the relationship between Nolting and your dad. How would you characterize it? And then talk a little bit about how it went off the rails.
Well, it's hard to know. I was 10, 11, 12 years old. These guys were supposedly best friends. Our families spent a lot of time together in Paris in the 60s, and of course in Saigon. We lived 2 blocks away. I would have thought it was a close and frank relationship. Of course, Nolting was the boss, and Nolting was also 8 years older than my father, 7 years older than my father. So more senior in the Foreign Service and more senior in general. And Nolting always, in looking back at the events of 1963, Nolting said that at a given point, he never had any idea that Bill saw things, my father saw things any differently than he did. But fatefully, Nolting went on vacation, home leave and a long vacation, just as the Buddhist crisis was exploding. And he said that he was shocked to discover that as soon as he left, that my father became very negative about the prospects of the Diem government, and in Nolting's view, my father was holding his finger up to see what Washington wanted, and following his own ambitions. And of course, I don't see it quite that way. I think my father's answer to that, which he gave, of course, never to me, but to oral historians, was that as soon as Nolting was gone and my father was in charge of the American mission, it was his job to call the shots as he saw them and to carry out the instructions that he was getting, rather than to call Fritz on his sailboat in the Aegean or to try to get in touch with him to see what Fritz thought should be done. And I think that was really what really got to Fritz, was that this guy that he had brought to Saigon and put in this important position had turned on him. He had bit the hand that had fed him. And I think it was over this seemingly small disagreement that the bad blood came between them. The other important event in the breakdown of that relationship, the one that stuck in my father's craw, was that after Nolting had left Saigon, he wrote what used to be called an efficiency report. We would call it a performance review, in which he questioned my father's loyalty. And I think there, I would say that he was mixing up my father's loyalty to him, to his old friend, with his loyalty to the mission or the government. And of course, those of you who are my age or older will remember that loyalty was a very strong word. Disloyalty was a strong thing to accuse someone of, only a few years after the McCarthy period, when there were loyalty tests and loyalty boards and that kind of thing. And I think it was that my father could never forgive, whereas Nolting had many people that he could blame for the fact that his ambassadorship ended rather brutally. He learned on the SS Constitution crossing the Atlantic that he'd been fired and replaced with Henry Cabot Lodge, and went back to Washington to a non-job and resigned from the Foreign Service a few months later, knowing that he didn't feel he had a future there.
So
Go ahead.
we need to go back to
Please.
to go back, set the stage a little bit here about why Nolting is going in one direction with Diem,
Okay.
and your father is going in another, and the role of Washington in all
Okay.
this in 1962-3.
Yes. So the 1962 was a year that seemingly things were improving in Vietnam. There was something called the Strategic Hamlet Program, which was attempting to regroup in the provinces of Vietnam, to regroup villages in defended, strategic hamlets they were called, to defend them from the Viet Cong. And this seemed to be working, and certainly in 1962, my father and Fritz Nolting were both, you have to call them hawks. They thought this was a war worth fighting, and here's the way we're going to do it. But I think
Everybody was a hawk in that.
everybody was a hawk. There was the hawks and doves that we know about today came along a few years later. People like David Halberstam and Neil Sheehan, who we think of as doves, if anybody was, were very much hawks as well. That was really not a term of reference. So I think what really began to drive a wedge between these two men and really between President Kennedy and the Diem government was that this was a gang that couldn't shoot straight. The government in Vietnam, people had no idea even who the family was. The elections were a bit of a farce. And no wonder, with things going the way they were, that they saw their cousins, who may have been Viet Cong, as representing their future and their interests more than this Catholic Mandarinite family in Saigon. And I think my father, sooner than Nolting, or Nolting never did really, realized that we had put our money on the wrong kind of people, and that we had been taken in over the years, not just in those years, by the fact that Diem and his family were Catholic, by the fact that they were French educated, and all the experts like my father and Nolting, they were assigned to Saigon because they spoke French. They had no real experience in Asia. And all the business of the government was conducted in French. So things were struggling along for the Diem government, but in May of 1963, there was a march in the city of Hue to celebrate the birthday of Buddha. And so the Buddhist community in Hue, where it was very strong, was out in the streets marching peacefully, and some of the police and military panicked over the crowds, and there was shooting and even children being crushed by armored personnel carriers, and so suddenly there was a big crisis, and neither Nolting and then later my father could get the government to apologize, to make gestures of reconciliation, and then Nolting went on his ill-fated. He said himself the worst mistake he ever made was to go on a 6-week vacation at that point, but he did. And shortly after he left was this first self-immolation, which suddenly commanded headlines around the world. The famous photograph taken by Malcolm Brown, the later New York Times reporter, he was with AP at the time, and just happened to have a camera with him when this happened, and happened to be the only one who got up for the march. Suddenly, this was on a major dossier for President Kennedy, and this was a very busy time for him because this is the day after the Buddhist bonds set himself on fire, was the day that Medgar Evers was killed in Alabama. So all hell was breaking loose in the American South as well. So this was a very intense moment for President Kennedy and his entourage, and all of this was playing out in this distant capital by these two guys, Nolting and Trueheart, who the president didn't really know.
Also, he's sending people out. The president's sending people out to Vietnam to
Constantly.
observe all this, of course, to second guess it all. And the military's out there, and they're not always on the same page. Talk
Correct.
a little bit about the different threads there and how your father navigated that.
Well, I think that, as I said a minute ago, that it was the military, which was growing at the time. Bear in mind there was only 1,500 American troops in Vietnam at the time of this 1963. Later, more than 500,000 were there. So, but still, this was the only big American military operation going on, and it was not going on very well. The CIA was another major player in all this. The CIA station chiefs were in close touch with the government family, with the Ngo family, and the divisions in the embassy in the American mission were along those lines. The military and Ambassador Nolting, the CIA somewhat in the middle, and the younger people in the embassy and in the aid mission, the younger Foreign Service officers, such as my father, who was in his mid-40s at the time, were fed up with Diem and thought this was just not working, and they thought it was time to do something about it. So one way to look back on this is that the people my father stood for or represented were pro-coup. We're supposed to be against coups now, but my father and his people were pro-coup, and Nolting, as he saw it, had been sent to work with this government, and he felt that his commitment was not just to his own president, but to the president to whom he was accredited, to Diem. And he became very close to Diem. Not that he didn't see his faults. Some of these tough messages that my father delivered to Diem when he was chargé there were not too different from what Nolting had been instructed to tell the government before he left, and even when he was in better odor. But the fact was that he was a very genial, warm guy, and I remember him well as somebody, a kind of a bear of a man, a lovely man, really. And I think my father was just not that kind of guy, and was a tougher cookie in some ways, and also didn't have the baggage of being the ambassador and having put his whole career on the line to support this government. He saw it differently. And
what was the role of the press? Where does David Halberstam come into this?
There were three reporters who are remembered as the famous triumvirate, who were all getting their starts as journalists then. David Halberstam, who was 28, Neil Sheehan, who was, I think, even younger, and Malcolm Brown, who I mentioned. They were reporting things as they saw them, and the picture that they presented wasn't pretty. And they were pissing off not just Nolting, but Trueheart. They were pissing off Kennedy and his advisors. And you can see in the message traffic going back to Saigon that, just like today, I'm sure, people in Washington, people read something in the paper, and immediately they're on the phone, they're on the wire to the embassy saying, what the hell, what are you going to do about this coverage we're getting? We're not looking good there. So they would constantly get rockets from Washington, something like the rockets I remember getting from the foreign desk of the Washington Post. What, they've got this. What about you? But the press, this was one of the early moments where the press was getting its reputation as being oppositionists, but it's clear in retrospect, and it was clear at the time, that they were getting a lot of their inside information from my father and from CIA people and from others, and they made names for themselves, especially Halberstam and Sheehan, who went on to have very distinguished. Well, they all three really had very distinguished careers as journalists.
So Nolting gets removed for Henry Cabot Lodge. Talk what happened there, and how did Nolting react to that? How did he find out about it?
Well, he found out about it. The stories, his family stories differ, but there was a knock on the door of their stateroom on the SS Constitution with a piece of wire copy announcing this news, which was the first time he'd heard that he'd been sacked. But it's unfair to say this came as a complete surprise, because as I discovered, and in fact to the surprise of his own family today, he really wanted out of this job. He made when he took the job in the spring of 1961, he says he told Dean Rusk that he would only do it for 2 years because he had family issues and he didn't want to. He was worried about the education of his 4 daughters. At the end of December 1962, so coming up on that second year limit, he went to Rusk and said, "You remember our conversation? It's time to find a new ambassador." And in Washington, they were dithering. He didn't get any straight answers about that. And they just said, "No, just stay on for a while. Yes, go ahead and take your vacation." When it came around to May, so now 2 years has already passed. And so I think on some level he realized that it wasn't working and he wanted out. But he wanted out in a way, as who would not, in a way that showed some respect to him, and being told to go ahead and take your vacation, turning over the embassy to somebody who was going to carry messages with a little more vigor than he was used to, and break with Nolting, and then learning about this not from his own superiors saying, "By the way, there's going to be an announcement tomorrow or next week." He learned about it the way the rest of us did, and he was extremely bitter about this. He didn't blame it, and it would be a stretch to say that he blamed my father for this. He had a lot of people to blame. The people in Washington, Roger Hilsman, who was the Assistant Secretary of State for Asia, as we say now, Averell Harriman, who was his real bête noire. Those two guys had no patience for Nolting or for his genial Southern ways, but even Fritz, the one daughter, Fritz had, as I said, Fritz had 4 daughters. 2 have died, and 1 is not able to communicate. So I've been working with one daughter, who's the one other daughter, who is now about 80, and she insists to this day that this news they got on the ship was the first they learned of any of this. And I know for a fact that he'd been desperately trying to finish his term there, and not afraid to say so. So I had a hard time explaining exactly why is it that he would tell everybody at the State Department that he wanted to go, but not his own family. I don't know. and that may remain a mystery.
So what was 11-year-old Charlie Trueheart doing while all this was going on?
Well, I was concerned with normal 11-year-old things. I was a sixth grader at the American school in Saigon. Obviously, all of us at the school, there were 800 students, K through 12, American students, mostly American, at that school. And, we did what 11 and 12-year-olds do, except that we were living in this country at war. But it's astonishing to me, having now raised children of my own with my wonderful wife, Anne, who was also in the bureau with me in Canada, and we were assigned together to these foreign bureaus that Brad mentioned.
What were you doing, Charlie?
What was I doing? I was doing things like getting into trouble. Like I was going to say that my parents, knowing what I know as a parent now, it seems shocking. But my parents gave me free rein around Saigon, and that was not just my parents who did that. All of us had our bicycles to ride around Saigon, even while there were bombs going off sometimes in one place or another. We were allowed to take the bicycle pousse-pousse, as they're called, but there was also motorcycle ones, which cost almost nothing to ride in, where you ride in the seat in the front, right? So it's highly hazardous. So we didn't tell our parents, but we actually took the motorcycle ones, and zipped around town. And school got out at 1 p.m. We started very early because of the heat. Everybody went home for the siesta period, including everybody at the embassy went home for lunch and for a siesta, or a sieste, as we say in French. So I was, getting up to no good and getting in some trouble, as I relate in the book, with some pals of mine.
Switchblades.
So we bought switchblades. Which we asked the guy at the Saigon Central Market to show us, hidden that they had these switchblades. So I owned those, and at one point, other sixth graders started a gang called the Unsociables. This is in the time of West Side Story had just come out as a movie at that time, and these other guys we knew had become the Unsociables. So we, my friends and I, formed our own gang, which we called the Mafia. This is very embarrassing, really. And the other, because it was cheap to have them made, the other guys and the Unsociables had these silk jackets made with that slogan on the back. But we had badges made that said Mafia, and then under Charlie or Robert, and with our badges. I mean, really, pathetic. Anyway, there's a story in the book about the worst moment when I got caught doing some bad things. I'll let you find it in the book.
Did you know there was a war going on all around you? Bombs going on?
Oh, of course. And I got in 1960, I think beginning of 63, the Viet Cong came into the theater, Capitol Kindo Theater, as it was called, where they showed American movies, and set off a bomb. And I was late for the movie, so I missed that. But it didn't seem to. I never got the sense like, well, okay, you're grounded while we see what's going on here. It
was a year later that Johnson kicked out all the dependents. I guess 2 years later.
It was about a year and a half after we left. We left in early '64, and I think it was winter of '65 that all the dependents had to leave Saigon. But it's amazing that we were still there, because I think now, in the Foreign Service, that would never happen. I mean, you wouldn't even go to that post with your spouse and children.
So we're going to open up to questions in a minute, but I do want to ask you before we do. Diem is assassinated by his own people, not by the CIA, by his own people. But how did your father feel about that? What was his role in that?
Well, by then Henry Cabot Lodge was the ambassador, and Henry Cabot Lodge came in August of that year, totally sold on the idea of a coup, and wasted no time in sending that signal through his favorite CIA agent, Lou Conin, to the Vietnamese generals who'd been dithering about a coup. And after several months, on the 1st of November, the coup happened. And it was a very successful coup in that there was very little violence. There was a lot of worry that when a coup came, for example, all the American dependents would have to be evacuated, and there are plans to stage to do that. But there was nothing like that. There was very little violence, possibly fewer than 100 people died in the coup. But two of the people who died were the president, Diem, and his brother and counselor and eminence grise, Ngo Dinh Diem. And in many years later, in retrospect, my father told an oral historian that he said that it was shocking but not surprising. We hear that phrase a lot these days, but no one should have been surprised that this would happen. And there was a lot of, it was in the interest of the generals who were carrying out the coup to make sure that Diem didn't go into exile, which is what they promised him before they picked him up and killed him, to have him in exile in some neighboring company stirring up trouble to try to come back to power. Henry Cabot Lodge said we didn't want a Colonel Blimp figure doing that. And I think, I mean, in a serious way, I think my father, I asked myself in the course of writing this book whether my father felt he had blood on his hands. And I think if the question is, did he feel he had blood on his hands because of Diem and Ngo, I think the answer is probably not. I think he was realistic. He was a real politic kind of guy. But I think the bigger question is whether he thought during all those years where he had a son who was draft eligible, whether he felt that in general the blood that was shed in the years that followed could have been avoided if he and his colleagues and people in the Kennedy administration had been able to find a solution that didn't wind us up there. So I think on one level, on the immediate level, no, but on the larger level, I think he was haunted by this war, and my mother told me that one of his greatest worries was that I was going to go back there and die, but I had a high lottery number, and that issue never came up.
Let's take some questions.
Please.
There's the microphone right here. Please come up to the phone and ask your question.
So I'm about 4 years older than you are, but I didn't pay any attention to politics when I was in high school, which is when you were there.
Mm-hmm.
I'm still confused about what it is that your father did that made the ambassador so angry and that made the ambassador think that your father was involved in his losing his job. Was your father against the military?
Well, I hate to say this. I think you'd have to read the book to.
Okay, but
because it took me, 120,000 words to try to explain this, and I won't try to do that now. But I think it was a terrible misunderstanding that might have been avoided if they had talked to each other. And one of the questions I asked during the course of this discussion in the book is, so they feel so terribly differently about prospects for the Diem government, how the war is being carried out, what should be done, and so forth. They worked this far away from each other. They'd known each other all those years. Did they never talk about this?
let me ask it a different way. Why was the ambassador sacked?
I think Kennedy felt that it was time for a change, for a new face. He was very attracted to the idea of naming a prominent Republican to the job and to give him some coverage, some political cover for his expected re-election campaign the next year. Kennedy actually respected Nolting and thought very highly of him, and one of the most, for me, fascinating and interesting episodes in this is in August, after Nolting has been fired, and there's another terrible development in the Vietnamese government's treatment of Buddhists,
Right.
the famous pagoda raids of August, and there's a big council at the White House to decide what to do. Kennedy says, I want Nolting in this discussion. This is the guy he's sacked. I want Nolting here because he understood Nolting had a reasonable point of view, and he wanted him to air it. And so Nolting comes in, and here's where we can start listening to that on audio tape, which is
Right.
amazing to listen to Nolting and to listen to the argumentation. It's a fascinating piece of history, but it's pretty complicated to say what exactly happened between these two guys. It was complicated.
Thank you.
Hello.
Hi.
I lived in Saigon at the time, the period that you're describing, and you had introduced this talk by using the phrase that there was a communist insurgency at that time. I know many people who would feel that it was first of all, they call it the American War. Secondly, they say that it's a war of self-determination. So can you help us understand why is it that there's such differences in views?
Well, I should say that I use the term communist insurgency just as shorthand, because I think that's the way many people here may have perceived it. But I think what my father was beginning to understand, and many others were beginning to understand, was that this was nationalism. It was communist only in the opportunistic sense, in that a pro-communist regime in the north was supporting the Viet Cong insurgency, and they were getting help and backing from Moscow and Beijing. I think everyone who has studied the Vietnam War now understands the very point that you're making, which was that for the ordinary Vietnamese person, certainly in the countryside, this was not a war between the democratic West and the communist East. And so, I think I'm glad you raised that point, because I think that's exactly true. And I think that's what the period I'm describing in this book is, when people were first beginning to understand that it's not just cowboys and Indians, to put it
I have
one
a
way.
follow-up, if I may.
Sure.
And that is, there was another ambassador, Ambassador Lilly. I don't know if you, James
Lilly in Korea.
in Korea.
Yes.
Yeah. And he made a statement that we, meaning the American government, could not understand why months, years after year, we kept thinking, okay, if we just kill another 10,000, eventually they're going to run out of people. And, we will win the war, because the news that was being sent home was that the war was going very well, and that
So Lilly was talking about Vietnam, not Korea.
Vietnam.
Okay.
He was talking about Vietnam. And he said he couldn't understand why, in spite of the body count and all that, what happened? Why did all of a sudden, they won? So,
Well, this was what 3 weeks after this coup d'état, Kennedy was murdered, and this was precisely the problem that Lyndon Johnson had to face, and began to just throw more and more weapons and men against this enemy, and it just continued not to work, and it took down his presidency and dominated the following presidency of Richard Nixon. So, yeah, it was how clear it all seems now.
Yes, thank you.
Hi. You had mentioned in your remarks questioning of David Halberstam, Sheehan, and other journalists about the official narratives regarding the war. And I'm just wondering, given this huge migration toward podcasting these days and the good journalists that are going with that and questioning these official narratives, what does this behold for our kind of this legacy of endless wars that we've been involved with? Is that going to change the business model?
The business model for wars? Well, I don't know. I mean, I think for one thing, many more people have a voice, and there's much more information coming out of war zones than was the case back then. Whether today's media environment is going to improve our chances of staying out of long wars, I'd have to say no. But I don't see the evidence of it. Do you, Evan? I mean, I don't think so.
Do you watch podcasting? Because there's this huge migration that's going over there, and there's all these young people that are watching podcasting, and the
Listening,
huge
yeah.
majority of them support Robert Kennedy, for example, who's against the war in Ukraine, whereas older generation is sticking to legacy media and its messaging.
Yeah.
And
I don't think that's all shaken out quite yet. But,
Yeah.
I'm not, there's probably all kinds of people listening to podcasts, and obviously people are getting a lot of information from a lot of different sources.
You don't mean
not
just
all
podcasts.
of it.
You're talking about TikTok and.
No, I'm talking about Joe Rogan, who, breaking points and things like that that are beating CNN in the radio.
There's a new model for how people get information, especially young people.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, Charlie.
I recognize you.
We've had a lot of chat about the historical side of things. I just want to ask about the personal side of things. But first of all, thank you for leaving me with the image of a Mafia "Hello, my name is" badge. I would pay pretty good money to have.
I wish I still had that.
So on the more personal level, when you completed the book, I wondered if you could just evoke what you felt upon finishing the book. And I'm curious about the impact among the people who might be personally affected that you may have heard from, given that everyone's going into the 80s, 90s, and the 100s.
Well, obviously the first feeling is relief. Anybody who's written a book will tell you that. But it blended seamlessly into trying to find a publisher, and then relief at finding a publisher and finding a very good publisher. Impact on people. Well, I can tell you that the one person who I care, whose opinion I care about a great deal, is Lindsay Nolting, who is, as I said, the Nolting daughter who helped me do all she could. To find information and to remember those days, although she was at Wellesley, not in Saigon. But of course, she's never read this book. I read her one chapter. There's a chapter in the middle of the book called Two Gentlemen of Virginia, which is about the backgrounds of these two guys, Fritz Nolting and Bill Trueheart. I read her that because there was a lot of information she'd helped me with, and she gave me a few corrections. But otherwise, she's not seen the book. Now she's got the book, and I'm kind of. I really want to know, because I think it's very fair to her father, but she and her family have spent a lifetime living, certainly as long as he was alive, and to some degree since then, a lifetime of regret over this terrible thing that happened to their father when he was 52 years old that he never got over. And so it's possible she's watching, but I'm very eager to hear what Lindsay thinks of this book, and I want to see her, and I hope I'm going to be speaking in Charlottesville in a couple of weeks, and I'm hoping that she will come to this event. And I said, I will, if you're there and you want to say something, you're invited to do that. But all she said is, in an email, I'm on page 126. So
I should say this book is unbelievably even-handed. I would say
Thank you.
even dispassionate, but it's not. It's a sensitive book, but it's judicious at the same time. So I'd be surprised if she gives you a hard time, Charlie.
I'd be surprised, but I do want to hear from her, because that would kind of close this circle in an important way.
There's a interesting little twist in this. Tell us about David Halberstam's role in the creation of this book.
You asked really good questions. Thank you. Well, David Halberstam, I've mentioned that he was not someone who I knew. I must have shaken his hand in Saigon. But later, after I got out of college and decided I wanted to be a journalist, probably at my father's instigation, he saw me and made some phone calls. I sat in his kitchen while he made some phone calls to editors of newspapers who he knew, and getting them on the phone instantly and saying, you should hire this guy. It turns out that I didn't get hired by any of those people, but it was pretty nice of him. Anyway, in my first job, which was in Greensboro, North Carolina, I had a hand in getting David Halberstam, who by then was very famous for The Best and the Brightest, and for other powers that be, just was coming out around then. I got him to speak, worked it out so that he could speak at a book event in Greensboro, North Carolina. And while he was waiting to go on stage, he and I went backstage for a cigarette. And that's when he started telling me, he said, there's an incredible novel here. And he started jotting stuff down on the back of this piece of paper, which turned out to be the 10 words that he was going to speak from when he made the speech. So I never saw the paper again. But he said, you've got these two guys from Virginia, and the one thing I remember is he said, he's got daughters, and your father has sons. As though this
Profound.
was, so I can build the whole novel around that. But anyway, so it is a fact that that a few times after that, in my 20s, in the late 70s, I did try to pitch this story as a novel to a couple of editors who turned me down. But of course, I still have some of those pitch letters, and I knew so little about this. I cannot imagine how I presumed to think I could write a novel about it when I didn't know anything. Of course, I was also not yet 30, and I think I know a lot better about things like this, about life now, than I did then. So luckily, I didn't write a bad novel about this, and I knew much later that it was going to have to be the work of history with a little bit of memoir thrown in.
I'm glad they turned down your novel, Charlie, because this is a wonderful book, and you should all come up here and buy it right now.
Thank you, Evan.
So copies of Charlie's book
Thank
are
you
available
all.
at the checkout desk. He'll be up here signing. Please form a line to the right of the table and help our staff by folding up your chairs. Thanks again.